Alchemists, welcome back. My name is Ava, aka queenmidaslifealchemist, and I am back for week 17. We are almost done with The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body and the Healing of Trauma. This is written by Bessel Van Der Kolk, MD. Again, this is week 17. If you are here for the first time, welcome. I'm so glad to have you. However, you might want to start from week 1 because we are working through this book and we are in the final chapters. So I'm going to pop the video up here in the top and go ahead and start from there. Also, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Like the video, share this content with anyone who you feel might benefit from the information in this book. It's very insightful, and it just talks about connecting stored trauma and trapped trauma, fears, anger, whatever that manifests itself physically and in mental and emotional cycles and like chronic patterns, and also with pain as well. So definitely stick with me, and we are going to continue to read through this. Also, check out my link tree down below in the description box. You'll find my Telegram channel, my booking link for private tarot and oracle readings, also a link for my Patreon. Come join me over there. I give private oracle readings. We have a private chat for the Patreon community only. There's a exclusive newsletter. You get early access to content. What else? Discounts in my partner's shops, which is Olivera by Liz, or by Elizabeth, excuse me, and that is Liz's Etsy shop, and then also Soulstone Organites, which is Dory's shop. So go check those out. And there's also a discount code for Body Align for EMF protection and some other frequency balancing protection and healing for our bodies. So it's just alternative ways to heal ourselves and take our power back in that way. Anything else? Oh, there's also links if you feel moved to donate or tip to my channel, which I highly appreciate, and I thank you so much for everybody who is contributing in that way. Also likes, shares, comments. I love your comments. I love to interact with you, so that energy exchange is also greatly appreciated as well. And again, I think I already mentioned, but yeah, come join my Telegram. We have fun over there. I can actually talk and like chat in real time, which we can't do as easily here on YouTube. But yeah, all right, so let's go ahead and get started. We are starting on page 304. This is called Rescripting Your Life. Nobody grows up under ideal circumstances, as if we even know what ideal circumstances are. As my late friend David Servin Schreiber once said, every life is difficult in its own way, but we do know that in order to become self-confident and capable adults, it helps enormously to have grown up with steady and predictable parents who delighted in you and your discoveries and explorations, parents who helped you organize your comings and goings, and who served as role models for self-care and getting along with other people. Defects in any of these areas are likely to manifest themselves later in life. A child who has been ignored or chronically humiliated is likely to lack self-respect. Children who have not been allowed to assert themselves will probably have difficulty standing up for themselves as adults. And most grown-ups who were brutalized as children carry a smoldering rage that will take a great deal of energy to contain. Our relationships will suffer as well. The more early pain and deprivation we have experienced, the more likely we are to interpret other people's actions as being directed against us, and the less understanding we will be of their struggles, insecurities, and concerns. If we cannot appreciate the complexity of our lives, we will see anything they do as a confirmation that we are going to get hurt and disappointed. In the chapters on the biology of trauma, we saw how trauma and abandonment disconnected people from their body as a source of pleasure and comfort, or even as a part of themselves that needs care and nurturance. When we cannot rely on our body to signal safety or warning and instead feel chronically overwhelmed by physical stirrings, we lose the capacity to feel at home in our own skin and by extension in the world. As long as our map of the world is based on trauma, abuse, and neglect, people are likely to seek shortcuts to oblivion. Anticipating rejection, ridicule, and deprivation, they are reluctant to try out new options, certain that these will lead to failure. This lack of experimentation traps people in a matrix of fear, isolation, and scarcity, where it is impossible to welcome the very experiences that might change their basic worldview. This is one reason the highly structured experiences of psychomotor therapy are so valuable. Participants can safely project their inner reality into a space filled with real people where they can explore the cacophony and confusion of the past. This leads to concrete aha moments. Yes, this is what it was like. That is what I had to deal with. And that is what it would have felt like back then if I had been cherished and cradled. Acquiring a sensory experience of feeling treasured and protected as a 3-year-old in the trance-like container of a structure allows people to re-script their inner experience, as in, I can spontaneously interact with other people without having to be afraid of being rejected or getting hurt. Structures harness the extraordinary power of the imagination to transform the inner narratives that drive and confine our functioning in the world. With the proper support, the secrets that once were too dangerous to be revealed can be disclosed, not just to a therapist, a Latter-day Father confessor, but in our imagination to the people who actually hurt and betrayed us. The three-dimensional nature of the structure transforms the hidden, the forbidden, and the feared into visible, concrete reality. In this, it is somewhat similar to IFS, which we explored in the previous chapter. IFS calls forth the split-off parts that you created in order to survive and enables you to identify and talk with them so that your undamaged self can emerge. In contrast, a structure creates a three-dimensional image of whom and what you had to deal with and gives you a chance to create a different outcome. Most people are hesitant to go into past pain and disappointment. It only promises to bring back the intolerable. But as they are mirrored and witnessed, the new reality begins to take shape. Accurate mirroring feels completely different from being ignored, criticized, and put down. It gives you permission to feel what you feel and know what you know. One of the essential foundations of recovery. Trauma causes people to remain stuck in interpreting the present and in light of an unchanging past. The scene you recreate in the structure may or may not be precisely what happened, but it represents the structure of your inner world, your internal map, and the hidden rules that you have been living by. So we are on to a new section called Daring to Tell the Truth. This is on page 306. I recently led another group structure with a 26-year-old man named Mark, who at age 13 had accidentally overheard his father having phone sex with his aunt, his mother's sister. Mark felt confused, embarrassed, hurt, betrayed, and paralyzed by this knowledge. But when he tried to talk with his father about it, he was met with rage and denial. He was told that he had a filthy imagination and accused of trying to break up the family. Mark never dared to tell his mom, but henceforth the family secrets and hypocrisy contaminated every aspect of his home life and gave him a pervasive sense that nobody could be trusted. After school, he spent his isolated adolescence hanging around the neighborhood basketball courts or in his room watching TV. When he was 21, his mother died of a broken heart, Mark says, and his father married the aunt. Mark was not invited to either the funeral or the wedding. Secrets like these become inner toxins, realities that you are not allowed to acknowledge to yourself or others, but that nevertheless become the template of your life. I knew none of this history when Mark joined the group, but he stood out by his emotional distance. And during check-ins, he acknowledged that he felt separated from everyone by a dense fog. I was quite worried about what would be revealed once we started to look behind his frozen, expressionless exterior. When I invited Mark to talk about his family, he said a few words and then seemed to shut down even more. So I encouraged him to ask for a contact figure to support him. He chose a white-haired group member, Richard, and placed Richard on a pillow next to him, touching his shoulder. Then, as he began to tell his story, Mark placed Joe as his real father, 10 feet in front of him, and directed Carolyn, representing his mother, to crouch in a corner with her face hidden. Mark next asked Amanda to play his aunt, telling her to stand defiantly to one side, arms crossed over her chest, representing all the calculating, ruthless, and devious women who are after men. Surveying the tableau he had created, Mark sat up straight, eyes wide open. Clearly the fog had lifted. I said, "A witness can see how startled you are seeing what you had to deal with." Mark nodded appreciatively and remained silent and somber for some time, then looked at his father and he burst out, "You asshole, you hypocrite, you ruined my life." I invited Mark to tell his father all the things that he had wanted to tell them but never could. A long list of accusations followed. I directed the father to respond physically as if he had been punched so that Mark could see that his blows had landed. It did not surprise me when Mark spontaneously said that he always worried about that his rage would get out of control and that his fear had kept him from standing up for himself in school, at work, and in other relationships. After Mark had confronted his father, I asked if he would like Richard to assume a new role, that of his ideal father. I instructed Richard to look Mark directly in the eye and say, "If I had been your ideal father back then, I would have listened to you and not accused you of having a filthy imagination." When Richard repeated this, Mark started to tremble. Oh my God, life would have been so different if I could have trusted my father and talked about what was going on. If I could have had a father. I then told Richard to say, "If I had been your ideal father back then, I would have welcomed your anger and said you would have had a father you could have trusted." Mark visibly relaxed and said that would have made the difference, all the difference in the world. Then Mark addressed the stand-in for his aunt. The group was visibly stunned as he unleashed a torrent of abuse on her. "You conniving whore, you backstabber. You betrayed your sister and ruined her life. You ruined our family." After he was done, Mark started to sob. He then said he'd always been deeply suspicious of any woman who showed up any interest in him. The remainder of the structure took another half hour in which we slowly set up conditions for him to create two new women: the ideal aunt, who did not betray her sister, but who helped support their isolated immigrant family, and the ideal mother, who kept her husband's interest and devotion, and so did not die of heartbreak. Mark ended the structure quietly surveying the scene he had created with a contented smile on his face. For the remainder of the workshop, Mark was an open and valuable member of the group, and 3 months later, he sent me an email saying that this experience had changed his life. He had recently moved in with his first girlfriend, and although they had some heated discussions about their new arrangement, he'd been able to take in her point of view without clamming up defensively, going back to his fear or rage, or feeling that she was trying to pull a fast one. He was amazed that he had felt okay disagreeing with her and that he was able to stand up for himself. He then asked for the name of a therapist in his community to help with the huge changes he was making in his life. And I fortunately had a colleague I could refer him to. New section, page 308. This is the last section in this chapter, called Antidotes to Painful Memories. Like the model mugging classes that I discussed in chapter 13, the structures in psychomotor therapy hold out the possibility of forming virtual memories that live side by side with the painful realities of the past and provide sensory experiences of feeling seen, cradled, and supported that can serve as antidotes to memories of hurt and betrayal. In order to change, people need to become viscerally familiar with realities that directly contradict the static feelings of the frozen or panicked self of trauma, replacing them with sensations rooted in safety, mastery, delight, and connection. As we saw in the chapter on EMDR, one of the functions of dreaming is to create associations in which the frustrating events of the day are interwoven with the rest of one's life. Unlike our dreams, psychomotor structures are still subject to the laws of physics, but they too can reweave the past. Of course, we can never undo what happened, but we can create new emotional scenarios, intense and real enough to diffuse and counter some of those old ones. The healing tableaus of structures offer an experience that many participants have never believed was possible for them. To be welcomed into a world where people delight in them, protect them, meet their needs, and make them feel at home. That's so, so beautiful. Okay, we are moving on to chapter 19. This is called Rewiring the Brain, Neurofeedback. And it starts off with a couple quotes, first from Nathaniel Hawthorne. Is it a fact, or have I dreamt it, that by means of electricity, the world of matter has become a great nerve, vibrating thousands of miles in a breathless point of time? And then this one is by William James. The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of the judgment, character, and will. Starting the chapter. So the summer after my first year of medical school, I worked as a part-time research assistant in Ernest Hartman's sleep laboratory at Boston State Hospital. My job was to prepare and monitor the study participants and to analyze their EEG or electroencephalogram or brainwave tracings. Subjects would show up in the evening. I would paste an array of wires onto their scalps and another set of electrodes around their eyes to register the rapid eye movements that occurred during dreaming. Then I would walk them to their bedrooms, bid them goodnight, and start the polygraph, a bulky machine with 32 pins that transmitted their brain activity into a continuous spool of paper. Even though our subjects were fast asleep, the neurons in their brains kept up their frenzied internal communication, which was transmitted to the polygraph throughout the night. I'd settled down to pore over the previous night's EEGs, stopping from time to time to pick up baseball scores on my radio and use the intercom to wake subjects whenever the polygraph showed an REM sleep cycle. I would ask what they had dreamed about and write down what they reported, and then in the morning help them fill out a questionnaire about sleep quality and send them on their way. Those quiet nights in Hartman's lab documented a great deal about REM sleep and contributed to building the basic understanding of sleep processes, which paved the way for the crucial discoveries that I discussed in chapter 15. However, until recently, the long-standing hope that the EEG would help us better understand how electrical brain activity contributes to psychiatric problems remained largely unrealized. Next section, this is page 310, called Mapping the Electrical Circuits of the Brain. Before the advent of the pharmacological revolution, it was widely understood that the brain activity depends on both chemical and electrical signals. The subsequent dominance of pharmacology almost obliterated interest in the electrophysiology of the brain for several decades. The first recording of the brain's electrical activity was made in 1924 by the German psychiatrist Hans Berger. This new technology was initially met with skepticism and ridicule by the medical establishment, but electroencephalography gradually became an indispensable tool for diagnosing seizure activity in patients with epilepsy. Berger discovered that different brainwave patterns reflected different mental activities. For example, trying to solve a math problem resulted in bursts at a moderately fast frequency band known as beta. He hoped that eventually science would be able to correlate different psychiatric problems with specific EEG irregularities. This expectation was fueled by the first reports on EEG patterns in behavior problem children in 1938. Most of these hyperactive and impulsive children had slower than normal waves in their frontal lobes. This finding has been reproduced innumerable times since then, and in 2013, slow wave prefrontal activity was certified by the Food and Drug Administration as a biomarker for ADHD. Slow frontal lobe electrical activity explains why these kids have poor executive functioning. The rational brains lack proper control over the emotional brains, which also occurs when abuse and trauma have made the emotional centers hyper alert to danger and organized for fight or flight. Early in my career, I also hoped that the EEG might help us to make better diagnosis, and between 1980 and 1990, I sent many of my patients to get EEGs to determine if their emotional instability was rooted in neurological abnormalities. The reports usually came back with the phrase nonspecific temporal lobe abnormalities. This told me very little, and because at that time the only way we could change these ambiguous patterns was with drugs that had more side effects than benefits, I gave up during routine EEGs on my patients. Then in 2000, a study by my friend Alexander McFarlane and his associates and researchers in Adelaide, Australia, rekindled my interest as it is documented, clear differences in information processing between traumatized subjects and a group of normal Australians. The researchers used a standardized test called the oddball paradigm, in which subjects were asked to detect the item that doesn't fit in a series of otherwise related images, like a trumpet in a group of tables and chairs. None of the images was related to trauma. In the normal group, key parts of the brain worked together to produce a coherent pattern of filtering, focus, and analysis. See the left image below, which I'll show the images in a second. In contrast, the brain waves of traumatized subjects were more loosely coordinated and failed to come together into a coherent pattern. Specifically, they did not generate the brainwave pattern that helps people pay attention to the task at hand by filtering out irrelevant information, the upward curve labeled N200. In addition, the core information processing configuration of the brain, the downward peak, P300, was poorly defined. The depth of the wave determines how well we are able to take in and analyze new data. This was important information about how traumatized people process non-traumatic information that has profound implications for understanding day-to-day information processing. These brainwave patterns could explain why so many traumatized people have trouble learning from experience and fully engaging in their daily lives. Their brains are not organized to pay careful attention to what is going on at the present moment. Okay, so here are these pictures. On the left is going to be the normal brain, and then the right's going to be the PTSD brain. So this says patterns of attention. Milliseconds after the brain is presented with input, it starts organizing the meaning of the incoming information. Normally, all regions of the brain correlate in a synchronized pattern. So we'll see here, these lines pretty much are shifting and changing together. So it looks like pretty uniform there. That's in the normal brain. And then while the brain waves in the PTSD are less well coordinated, the brain has trouble filtering out irrelevant information and has problems attending to the stimulus at hand. So because this is all able to be on one page and stay focused on the information and group it together and find irregularities and filter those out, this one is not. It's not able to designate or I guess separate information as well as a normal brain. So that's the PTSD brain. And you see that the lines are not as uniform as this one. Okay, moving back on. So we're continuing on page 312. Sandy McFarlane's study reminded me of what Pierre Genet had said back in 1889. Traumatic stress is an illness of not being able to be fully alive in the present. Years later, when I saw the movie The Hurt Locker, which dealt with the experiences of soldiers in Iraq, I immediately recalled Sandy's study. As long as they were coping with extreme stress, these men performed with pinpoint focus. But back in civilian life, they were overwhelmed, having to make simple choices in a supermarket. We are now seeing alarming statistics about the number of returning combat veterans who enroll in college on the GI Bill but do not complete their degrees. Some estimates are over 80%. Their well-documented problems with focusing and attention are surely contributing to these poor results. McFarlane's study clarified a possible mechanism for the lack of focus and attention to PTSD, but it also presented a whole new challenge. Was there any way to change these dysfunctional brainwave patterns? It was 7 years before I learned that there might be ways to do that. In 2007, I met Sibern Fisher at a conference on attachment disordered children. Sibern was the formal clinical director of a residential treatment center for severely disturbed adolescents. And she told me that she'd been using neurofeedback in her private practice for about 10 years. She showed me before and after drawings made by a 10-year-old. The boy had such severe temper tantrums, learning disabilities, and overall difficulties with self-organization that he could not be handled in school. His first family portrait on the left opposite, drawn before treatment, was at the developmental level of a 3-year-old. Less than 5 weeks later, after 20 sessions of neurofeedback, his tantrums had decreased and his drawing showed a marked improvement in complexity. 10 weeks later, and another 20 sessions later, his drawings took another leap in complexity and his behavior normalized. I had never come across a treatment that could produce such a dramatic change in mental functioning in so brief a period of time. So when Sibern offered to give me a neurofeedback demonstration, I eagerly accepted. Here is the depiction of what we're talking about, or what their Bessel was just discussing here. So it says, from stick figures to clearly defined human beings. After 4 months of neurofeedback, a 10-year-old boy's family drawings show the equivalent of 6 years of mental development. So this is the initial one where they were saying, it looks like a 3-year-old drew it, where there's just stick figures, there's no attempt at detail or anything there. This is after, I believe they said 10 sessions. Or no, drawing after 20 sessions. You see their eyes are filled out, they have clothes on, there's more detail and development there. And then the very last one is after 40 sessions. It's just cute. After 40 sessions where there's more skill, it shows, and like attention placed on the drawing. So that's pretty incredible after just 40 sessions, and I don't know how many weeks did they say? 5 weeks. So I don't know, maybe that was like 15 or 20 weeks together. Interesting. All right, so we are moving on to a new section called Seeing the Symphony of the Brain. At Sibern's office in Northampton, Massachusetts, she showed me her neurofeedback equipment, 2 desktop computers and a small amplifier, and some of the data she had collected. She then pasted 1 electrode on each side of my skull and another on my right ear. Soon the computer in front of me was displaying rows of brain waves like the ones I'd seen on the sleep lab polygraph 3 decades earlier. Sibern's tiny laptop could detect, record, and display the electrical symphony of my brain faster and more precisely than what had probably been $1 million worth of equipment in Hartman's lab. That's pretty incredible. As Sibern explained, feedback provides the brain with a mirror of its own function. The oscillations and rhythms that underpin the currents and cross currents of the mind. Neurofeedback nudges the brain to make more of some frequencies and less of others, creating new patterns that enhance its natural complexity and its bias towards self-regulation. In effect, she told me, we may be freeing up innate but stuck oscillatory properties on the brain and allowing new ones to develop. Sibern adjusted some settings to set the reward and inhibit frequencies, as she explained, so that the feedback would reinforce selected brainwave patterns while discouraging others. Now I was looking at something like a video game featuring 3 spaceships of different colors. The computer was emitting irregular tones and the spaceships were moving quite randomly. I discovered that when I blinked my eyes, they stopped, and when I calmly stared at the screen, they moved in tandem, accompanied by regular beeps. Sibern then encouraged me to make the green ship move ahead of the others. I leaned forward to concentrate, but the harder I tried, the more the green spaceship fell behind. She smiled and told me that I'd do much better if I just relax and let my brain take in the feedback that the computer was generating. So I sat back, and after a while, the tones grew steadier and the green spaceship started to pull ahead of the others. I felt calm and focused, and my ship was winning. In some ways, neurofeedback is similar to watching someone's face during a conversation. If you see smiles or slight nods, you're rewarded, and you go on telling your story or making your point. But the moment your conversation partner looks bored or shifts her gaze, you'll start to wrap up or change the topic. In neurofeedback, the reward is a tone or movement on the screen instead of a smile. And the inhibition is far more neutral than a frown. It's simply an undesired pattern. Next, Sabern introduced another feature of neurofeedback, its ability to track circuitry in specific parts of the brain. She moved the electrodes from my temples to my left brow, and I started to feel sharp and focused. She told me she was rewarding beta waves in my frontal cortex, which accounted for my alertness. When she moved the electrodes to the crown of my head, I felt more detached from the computer images and more aware of the sensations in my body. Afterward, she showed me a summary graph that recorded how my brain waves had changed as I experienced subtle shifts in my mental state and physical sensations. How could neurofeedback be used to help treat trauma? As Sabern explained, with neurofeedback, we hope to intervene in the circuitry that promotes and sustains states of fear and traits of fearlessness, shame, and rage. It is the repetitive firing of these circuits that redefines trauma. Patients need help to change the habitual patterns created by trauma and its aftermath. When the fear patterns relax, the brain becomes less susceptible to autonomic stress reactions and better able to focus on ordinary events. After all, stress is not an inherent property of events themselves. It is a function of how we label and react to them. Neurofeedback simply stabilizes the brain and increases the resiliency, allowing us to develop more choices in how to respond. New section on page 315. This is called The Birth of Neurofeedback. Please remember, if you are enjoying this episode, to like the video. If you have anything to add in or any questions or anything, please put them in the comments. Okay, The Birth of Neurofeedback, page 315. Neurofeedback was not a new technology in 2007. As early as the late 1950s, University of Chicago psychology professor Joe Kamiya, who was studying the phenomenon of internal perception, had discovered that people could learn through neurofeedback to tell when they were producing alpha waves, which are associated with relaxation. It took some subjects only 4 days to reach 100% accuracy. He then demonstrated that they could also enter voluntarily into an alpha state in response to a simple sound cue. In 1968, an article about Kamiya's work was published in the popular magazine Psychology Today. And the idea that alpha training could relieve stress and stress-related conditions became widely known. The first scientific work showing that neurofeedback could have an effect on pathological conditions was done by Barry Sterman at UCLA. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration had asked Sterman to study the toxicity of a rocket fuel, monomethyl hydrazine, or MMH, which was known to cause hallucinations, nausea, and seizures. Sterman had previously trained some cats to produce a specific EEG frequency known as the sensory motor rhythm. In cats, this alert focused state is associated with waiting to be fed. He discovered that while his ordinary lab cats developed seizures after exposure to MMH, the cats that received neurofeedback did not. The training had somehow stabilized their brains. In 1971, Sterman attached his first human subject, 23-year-old Mary Fairbanks, to a neurofeedback device. She had suffered from epilepsy since the age of 8, with grand mal seizures 2 or more times a month. She trained for an hour a day, twice a week. At the end of 3 months, she was virtually seizure-free. Sterman subsequently received a grant from the National Institutes of Health to conduct a more systematic study, and the impressive results were published in the Journal of Epilepsia in 1978. This period of experimentation and huge optimism about the potential of the human mind came to an end in the middle 1970s with newly discovered psychiatric drugs. Psychiatry and brain science adopted a chemical model of mind and brain, and other treatment approaches were relegated to the back burner. Since then, the field of neurofeedback has grown by fits and starts, with much of the scientific groundwork being done in Europe, Russia, and Australia. Even though there are about 10,000 neurofeedback practitioners in the United States, the practice has not been able to garner the research funding necessary to gain widespread acceptance. One reason may be that there are multiple competing neurofeedback systems. Another is that the commercial potential is limited. Only a few applications are covered by insurance, which makes neurofeedback expensive for consumers and prevents practitioners from amassing the resources necessary to do large-scale studies. Okay, page 316, we are on a new section called From a Homeless Shelter to the Nursing Station. Sabern had arranged for me to speak with 3 of her patients. All told remarkable stories, but as I listened to 27-year-old Lisa, who was studying nursing at a nearby college, I felt myself truly awakening to the stunning potential of this treatment. Lisa possessed the greatest single resilience factor humans can have. She was an appealing person, engaging, curious, and obviously intelligent. She made great eye contact, and she was eager to share what she had learned about herself. Best of all, like so many survivors I've known, she had a wry sense of humor and a delicious take on human folly. Based on what I knew about her background, it was a miracle that she was so calm and self-possessed. She had spent years in group homes and mental hospitals, and she was a familiar presence in the emergency rooms of Western Massachusetts. The girl who regularly arrived by ambulance, half dead from prescription drug overdoses or bloody from self-inflicted wounds. Here is how she began her story. I used to envy the kids who knew what would happen when their parents got drunk. At least they could predict the havoc. In my home, there was no pattern. Anything could set my mother off. Eating dinner, watching TV, coming home from school, getting dressed, and I never knew what she was going to do or how she would hurt me. It was so random. Her father had abandoned the family when Lisa was 3 years old, leaving her at the mercy of her psychotic mother. Torture is not too strong a word to describe the abuse she endured. I lived up in the attic room, she told me, and there was another room up there where I would go and piss on the carpet because I was too scared to go downstairs to the bathroom. I would take all of the clothes off my dolls and drive pencils into them and put them up in my window. When she was 12 years old, Lisa ran away from home and was picked up by the police and returned. After she ran away again, Child Protective Services stepped in, and she spent the next 6 years in mental hospitals, shelters, group homes, foster families, and on the street. No placement lasted, but Lisa was so dissociated and self-destructive that she terrified her caretakers. She would attack herself or destroy furniture, and afterwards she would not remember what she had done, which earned her a reputation as a manipulative liar. In retrospect, Lisa told me she simply lacked the language to communicate what was going on with her. When she turned 18, she matured out of Child Protective Services and started an independent life, one without a family, education, money, or skills. But shortly after discharge, she ran into Sabern, who had just acquired her first neurofeedback equipment, and remember Lisa from the residential treatment center where she had worked. She'd always had a soft spot for this lost girl, and she invited Lisa to try out her new gizmo. As Sabern recalled, when Lisa first came to see me, it was fall. She walked around with a vacant stare, carrying a pumpkin wherever she went. There just wasn't a there. I wasn't ever sure that I had gotten any organizing self. Any form of talk therapy was impossible for Lisa. Whenever Sabern asked her about anything stressful, she would shut down or go into a panic. In Lisa's words, every time we tried to talk about what had happened to me growing up, I would have a breakdown. I would wake up with cuts and burns, and I wouldn't be able to eat. I wouldn't be able to sleep. Her sense of terror was omnipresent. I was afraid all the time. I didn't like to be touched. I was always jumpy and nervous. I couldn't close my eyes if another person was around. There was no convincing me that someone wasn't going to kick me the second I closed my eyes. That makes you feel crazy. You know you're in a room with someone you trust. You know intellectually that nothing's going to happen to you, but then there's the rest of your body and you can't ever relax. If someone put their arm around me, I would just check out. She was stuck in a state of inescapable shock. Lisa recalled dissociating when she was a little girl, but things got worse after puberty. I started waking up with cuts, and people at school would know me by different names. I couldn't have a steady boyfriend because I would date other guys when I was dissociated and then not remember. I was blacking out a lot and opening my eyes into some pretty strange situations. Like many severely traumatized people, Lisa could not recognize herself in a mirror. I had never heard anyone describe so articulately what it was like to lack a continuous sense of self. There was no one to confirm her reality. When I was 17 and living in a group home for severely disturbed adolescents, I cut myself up really badly with the lid of a tin can. They took me to the emergency room, but I couldn't tell the doctor what I had done to cut myself. I didn't have any memory of it. The ER doctor was convinced that dissociative identity disorder didn't exist. A lot of people involved in mental health tell you it doesn't exist. Not that you don't have it, but that it doesn't exist. The first thing Lisa did after she aged out of her residential treatment program was to go off her medications. This doesn't work for everybody, she acknowledged, but it turned out to be personally the right choice. I know people who need meds, but that was not the case for me. After going off them and starting neurofeedback, I became much clearer. When she invited Lisa to do neurofeedback, Sabern had little idea what to expect, as Lisa would be the first dissociative patient she tried it on. They met twice a week and started by rewarding more coherent brain patterns in the right temporal lobe, the fear center of the brain. After a few weeks, Lisa noticed that she wasn't as uptight around people, and she no longer dreaded the basement laundry room in her building. When then came a bigger breakthrough. She stopped dissociating. I'd always had a constant hum of low-level conversations in my head, she recalled. I was scared. I was schizophrenic. After half a year of neurofeedback, I stopped hearing those noises. I integrated, I guess. Everything just came together. As Lisa developed a more continuous sense of self, she became able to talk about her experiences. I now can actually talk about things like my childhood. For the first time, I started being able to do therapy. Up until then, I didn't have enough distance and I couldn't calm down enough. If you're still in it, it's hard to talk about it. I wasn't able to attach in the way that you need to attach and open up in the way that you need to open up in order to have any type of relationship with a therapist. This was a stunning revelation. So many patients are in and out of treatment, unable to meaningfully connect because they are still in it. Of course, when people don't know who they are, they can't possibly see the reality of the people around them. Lisa went on, there was so much anxiety around attachment. I would go into a room and try to memorize every possible way to get out, every detail about a person. I was trying desperately to keep track of everything that could hurt me. Now I know people in a different way. It's not based on memorizing them out of fear. When you're not afraid of being hurt, you can know people differently. This articulate woman had emerged from the depths of despair and confusion with a degree of clarity and focus that I'd never seen before. It was clear that we had to explore the potential of neurofeedback at the trauma center. Next section on page 319 called Getting Started and Neurofeedback. First, we had to decide which of 5 different existing neurofeedback systems to adopt, and then find a long weekend to learn the principles and practice on one another. 8 staff members and 3 trainers volunteered their time to explore the complexities of EEGs, electrodes, and computer-generated feedback. On the second morning of the training, when I was partnered with my colleague Michael, I placed an electrode on the right side of his head, directly over the sensory motor strip of his brain, and rewarded the frequency of 11 to 14 hertz. Shortly after the session ended, Michael asked for the attention of the group. He just had a remarkable experience, he told us. He had always felt somewhat on edge and unsafe in the presence of other people, even colleagues like us. Although nobody seemed to notice, he was, after all, a well-respected therapist. He lived in a chronic, gnawing sense of danger. That feeling was now gone, and he felt safe, relaxed, and open. Over the next few years, Michael emerged from his habitual low profile to challenge the group with his insights and opinions. and he became one of the most valuable contributors to our neurofeedback program. With the help of the ANS Foundation, we started our first study with a group of 17 patients who had not responded to previous treatments. We targeted the right temporal area of the brain, the location that our early brain scan studies described in chapter 3 had shown to be excessively activated during traumatic stress, and gave them 20 neurofeedback sessions over 10 weeks. Because most of these patients suffered from alexithymia, it was not easy for them to report their response to the treatments, but their actions spoke for them. They consistently showed up on time for their appointments, even if they had to drive through snowstorms. None of them dropped out. And at the end of the full 20 sessions, we could document significant improvements, not only in their PTSD scores, but also in their interpersonal comfort, emotional balance, and self-awareness. They were less frantic, they slept better, and they felt calmer and more focused. In any case, self-reports can be unreliable. Objective changes in behavior are much better indicators of how well treatment works. The first patient I treated with neurofeedback was a good example. He was a professional man in his early 50s who defined himself as heterosexual, but he compulsively sought homosexual contact with strangers whenever he felt abandoned and misunderstood. His marriage had broken up around this issue, and he had become HIV positive. He was desperate to gain control over his behavior. During a previous therapy, he had talked extensively about his sexual abuse by an uncle at around the age of 8. We assumed that his compulsion was related to that abuse, but making that connection had made no difference in his behavior. After more than a year of regular psychotherapy with a competent therapist, nothing had changed. A week after I started to train his brain to produce slower waves in his right temporal lobe, he had a distressing argument with his girlfriend. And instead of going to his habitual cruising spot to find sex, he decided to go fishing. I attributed that response to chance. However, over the next 10 weeks, in the midst of his tumultuous relationship, he continued to find solace in fishing and began to renovate a lakeside cabin. When we skipped 3 weeks of neurofeedback because of our vacation schedules, his compulsion suddenly returned, suggesting that his brain had not yet stabilized its new pattern. We trained for 6 more months, and now 4 years later, I could see him about every 6 weeks for a checkup. He has felt no further impulse to engage in his dangerous sexual activities. How did his brain come to derive comfort from fishing rather than from compulsive sexual behavior? At this point, we simply didn't know. Neurofeedback changes brain connectivity patterns. The mind follows by creating new patterns of engagement. New section called Brainwave Basics from Slow to Fast. This is page 320. Each line on an EEG chart, charts the activity in a different part of the brain, a mixture of different rhythms ranged on a scale from slow to fast. The EEG consists of measurements of varying heights or amplitude and wavelengths or frequency. Frequency refers to the number of times a waveform rises and falls in 1 second, and it is measured in hertz or cycles per second. Every frequency on the EEG is relevant to understanding and treating trauma, and the basics are relatively easy to grasp. Delta waves, the slowest frequencies from 2 to 5 hertz, are seen most often during sleep. The brain is in an idling state and the mind is turned inward. If people have too much slow wave activity while they're awake, their thinking is foggy and they exhibit poor judgment and poor impulse control. 80% of children with ADHD and many individuals diagnosed with PTSD have excessive slow wave in their frontal lobes. Okay, here's a picture of an electroencephalogram of the EEG, and this says, while there is no typical signature for PTSD, many traumatized people have sharply increased activity in the temporal lobes, as this patient does, T3, T4, and T5. Those are the waves here, I believe. Yeah. Neurofeedback can normalize these abnormal brain patterns and thereby increase emotional stability. So this is the graph here, the electroencephalogram. here, and this is super small, but this is T3, this line right here. T4 is this other one that shows a lot more activity here. And then T5 is going to be the next one that shows like higher amplitudes there. Yeah, so this is showing that people with PTSD have more sharply increased activity in their temporal lobes. So that's why those amplitudes are so much higher than the other ones, and the T stands for temporal. Okay, so this, I believe, is our final section for today. It is. Okay, we are on page 321. The rate of brainwave firing is related to our state of arousal. Dreaming speeds up brainwaves. Theta frequencies from 5 to 8 hertz predominate at the edge of sleep, as in the floating hypnopompic state I described in chapter 15 on EMDR. They are also characteristic of hypnotic trance states. Theta waves create a frame of mind unconstrained by logic or by ordinary demands of life, and thus open the potential for making novel connections and associations. One of the most promising EEG neurofeedback treatments for PTSD, alpha theta training, makes use of that quality to loosen frozen associations and facilitate new learning. On the downside, theta frequencies also occur when we're out of it or depressed. Alpha waves from 8 to 12 hertz are accompanied by a sense of peace and calm. They are familiar to anyone who has learned mindfulness meditation. A patient once told me that neurofeedback worked for him like meditation on steroids. I use alpha training most often in my practice to help people who are either too numb or too agitated to achieve a state of focused relaxation. Walter Reed National Military Medical Center recently introduced alpha training instruments to treat soldiers with PTSD, but at the same time of this writing, the results are not yet available. Beta waves are the fastest frequencies from 13 to 20 hertz. When they dominate the brain, is oriented to the outside world. Beta enables us to engage in focused attention while performing a task. However, high beta over 20 hertz is associated with agitation, anxiety, and body tenseness. In effect, we are constantly scanning the environment for danger. That's really interesting because I believe, I could be wrong, so definitely check up on this. And that's the end of this reading for today. I believe that movies and music place us into a state, a beta wave state, and you can look this up. But if here again, it says when they dominate, the brain is oriented to the outside world, so it's easier to receive information from outside and be externally influenced. Beta enables us to engage in focused attention while performing a task. So that's almost like a mindless type of movement, a mindless type of navigating through the world, or like a zombie-like state. So listen to this. Enables us to engage in focused attention on what's coming at us while performing a task. So it's like autopilot. However, high beta over 20 hertz is associated with agitation, anxiety, and body tenseness. In effect, we are constantly scanning the environment for danger. So that's easy. That's like putting in a fight or flight, fear state. So that is very interesting that this is talked about here. And I would encourage you to look, this is kind of a side note, but it's coming to me and I feel like I need to share it. I would encourage you to look up, and you might have to scour for this information because it might not just be out there for you to find, but look up frequencies that are brainwave frequencies that are subliminally placed into movies, music, commercials, shows on TV and whatnot. And I'm pretty sure that it's beta waves. So definitely look into that if you feel called to. Really interesting. Also, I did a tribe talk where I talked about sound. Was it sound healing or binaural beats? And I went through I discussed the different brain waves as well. And here is a depiction of it. I almost forgot. So this this shows the delta waves, which are less than 4 cycles per second, and then the theta waves, which are 4 to 8 cycles per second. So delta is when we're in deep sleep here, when we're in sleep. Theta is like drowsy. That's when we're like falling into deep sleep and out of sleep. So those two brain waves there, it says depression, ADD, and seizure activity occurs in that range. From alpha, 8 to 12 cycles per second is relaxed focus. So that's very good for meditation. And then SMR, 12 to 15 cycles per second is relaxed thought. So I would think that this is just me intuiting. Relaxed focus is like just being, not thinking. And then relaxed thought, that might be, I don't know, more like, I'm not sure how to. We train the brain to move into this range to modify symptoms of depression, ADD, and improve seizure activity. Okay, relaxed thought. Maybe that means like, instead of having so many thoughts going on, it's like focusing on a single thought. Beta here, 12 to, oh, let me show, I don't think I showed those. So here, relaxed focus. So you see the amplitudes are still like spaced apart pretty far. It's not a whole lot of like overactive brain activity. This is where we're more restful and able to meditate. Here is relaxed thought. So there's more brain activity happening there, but it's still kind of like a focused brain activity. Here, we're starting to get more brain activity in the beta from 12 to 18. Is that what it says? 15 to 18 cycles per second, active thinking. So I think that one's good for studying, actually, I believe. Or programming. Then we have high beta, more than 19 cycles per second, excited. So that's when we're very in like it says, an excited state, can be like fight or flight, or almost like an overactivity that cycles and what is the word? Stimulates like sympathetic nervous system, so like fight or flight. But it says we train the brain to move into this range to modify symptoms of depression, ADD, and improve seizure activity. There. So, okie doke, you all. That is the end for today. Thank you so much for being here. Very interesting information, this book. I just love the connection, the brain body connection, and especially how it ties into trauma and healing mental and emotional dis-ease. So this is really, really beautiful, you all. Please remember to like and share the video, comment if you have something to say or you'd like to get a discussion started. Again, please, in my description box below is all the information that you will need. I believe my email's down there as well. I think it's still down there, but my booking link for personal tarot and oracle readings, my link for joining my Patreon, links for tip jar, and also my affiliate links there as well if you would like to check them out for some holiday shopping for yourself or your loved ones. You all, thank you so much for being here. Please remember you are sovereign, powerful, worthy, and loved. I will see you on the next one. Take care. Bye.